to the Kemetic How-To Guide for Egyptian Pagan and Kemetic practitioners. I'm your host, Sharon. I'm finally back with a topic that I promised last year I would do, which was to review Eye of the Sun, The Sacred Legacy of Ancient Egypt by Kerry Wisner. Funny thing is, I had taped a review of this back in, I believe it was November, and then I accidentally deleted the footage. So, here we are again. And now, I have a lot of things to say about this book. Some of them bad, some of them good. So let's get started with some of the critiques that I have about this book first. Number one, there were frequent typos in this book. Now, this book comes from a tradition, the tradition of Hwt-Hru, or Hwt-Hru, which began in the late 90s, so they've been around for 20 years now, as hard as that is for me to conceptualize. The 90s, we were just there. But this was the material that they studied with, presumably. So, why did no one act as grammar police? Because there were a lot of typos in this. And those of you who've been in a group, especially Coven, you know there's going to be somebody in the group who makes it their sole mission in life to point out all of your mistakes. Why did nobody do that in here? Especially when it got to the discussion of Hathor's scared cattle. Not sacred cattle, scared cattle. Spellcheck and Grammarly probably aren't going to pick that up, because scared and sacred, they're both adjectives, they're both describing the same thing, they're spelled correctly. The only way you're going to know is if you bother to reread your stuff. The reason I'm saying this, and I'm being a little hard on them, is because self-publishing means you've got to be vigilant. You've got to police yourself on mistakes and know your strengths and weaknesses. Especially if you're a pagan author, we have a hard time being taken seriously, and so we've got to hold ourselves to a higher standard because we want to be treated as the serious authors that we are. So, I would really recommend a second edition of this that cleans up some of those mistakes. Related to that would be citation errors. The footnotes that it gives, and that's another thing I noticed about a lot of pagan authors. They are in love with their footnotes, and I'm sure the fact that I don't use a lot of footnotes drives people crazy. But all he gives is the last name of the author, the date, and the page numbers. And for one, really good footnotes, and a lot of scholarly articles have done this. They'll include footnotes that kind of elaborate a point a little bit, or will give, you know, in that vein, see, check this out too. And so it's like an aside in the text. Here you don't have any of that. He's basically just using it to, you know, cite information that's then in the bibliography, or at least most of it is. Because I was going through here and I'd find a footnote, look for the citation, then go try to find it in the bibliography, and I discovered,
of all the circuit glitch diode blowing dimwittery, you left a piece out.
You left some things out. And this became a real problem with two Leskos, because when you're reading Egyptology books, there are two published authors by the last name of Lesko. There's Barbara Lesko and Leonard H. Lesko. They're married. Okay, and Barbara Lesko wrote Great Goddesses of Egypt, which, since this is a book centering on worship of Hathor, I would presume was his source in question. But Leonard H. Lesko has edited or published a number of things, including a book about the villagers of Deir el-Medina, and that's in my library too. Which one is it? You wouldn't know unless he bothered to put it in the bibliography. So, again, second edition maybe? Third point. Dude, psychology is not your forte. In chapter 6, and the way this book is organized, he's trying to kind of take you through preparations to get deeper and deeper involved with working with the Hwt-Hru, and especially with Hathor. And in chapter 6, he's trying to describe the mental preparations for ritual, which is fine and good, but why did you have to drag Freudian psychoanalysis into this? Especially when, okay, the author is certified as a hypnotist, But hypnotism is not the same thing as psychology. You do not have to be trained in psychology to be a hypnotist, which is actually kind of scary when you think about it. I'm trying to mess with people's minds. I'm not saying that's what he's trying to do here, but I got to this stuff and I said, well, let me talk to the trained, licensed mental health professionals that I know. And so we sat down over dinner and I explained to them the stuff that was in chapter 6 where he talks about the super consciousness, which actually he's probably thinking of super ego, which is something different. And I explained this and they said, oh, well, did he mention the sex? Wherefore you mean? Well, in Freudian psychology, that's a major element. Oh, no. So, in other words, he's taking a lot of psychology terms out of context. And it's not even really relevant to the discussion, I think. He does a much better job talking about meditation in chapter 9. There are some things he says in there that I can tell are based on personal experience because they've resonated with things that I was aware of, with one major exception. And that's point 4. Mystical priest worship. Now, we talked about this with Temple of the Cosmos, which was another book that made me crazy. And unfortunately, the one thing about this that really made me crazy was that he cited this several times. Can't get away from that guy. And in chapter 9, Kerry Wisner says, regarding meditation, throughout its long history, the Egyptian priesthood took this discipline to incredible heights in their preparation for and practice of ritual. Oh, really? The problem is, we don't have any basis for this. By contrast, you look at the Eastern traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism, they've got stacks and stacks of treatises that have been written over the centuries about meditation and about the preparation of mind. This goes into China, too. There was a Chinese Buddhist sage named Tian Tai who talked about preparatory steps in meditation, and I could get into a whole discussion about that, but that's not our point here. Point is, dude, the priests were, in a lot of cases, people working a paid position. And so, a lot of them were human, okay? I keep imagining that you have the folks at the head of the line as they're going through the temple, and yes, they're the ones with the highest rank, but they're the ones that were appointed by the pharaoh, and so this is a cushy job to them. Meanwhile, you have the temple singers and the sistrum bearers in the back, and they're happy to be here, and they're having a spiritual experience, you know, and so that's kind of what I see sometimes when I think about it back then. That wasn't the case all the time, but you have to let the ancient Egyptians be human, okay? That's another of my pet peeves. But my biggest pet peeve and my biggest complaint in here was the idea of nature as ultimate God. No, no, no! This is basically the same supposition that the House of Nature uses, and there is a connection between Hwt-Hru tradition and House of Nature. In as much as Kerry Wisner and probably a few other folks in it had been with the House of Nature for a while. And the only thing that he doesn't do is really, you know, use the loaded language of calling the gods, the deities, names. The House of Nature posits the idea that you have one central source of divinity, one godhead that they refer to as Nature. So House of Nature means House of God. And all of the other deities are just manifestations of that Nature.
That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.
That's not how this works. And the problem here is Wisner's trying to support that point with some citations that when you go and you look it up, he's citing somebody who was quoted in another work, and they're fragmentary and meaningless. And if you want to read further about the idea of divinity in ancient Egypt, again, I've mentioned them before and I'll mention them again. Conceptions of God in Ancient Egypt, the one and the many by Eric Hornung. If you read the entire book, and not just the selections that the beginner course for House of Nature tells you to read, he takes that whole idea of Nature as ultimate God and slams it. And then you have The Search for God in Ancient Egypt by Jan Assmann, which goes a little further than that. You can kind of think of it this way. Eric Hornung takes a soft polytheist approach to Egyptian religion. Jan Osman is your hard polytheist. Both of them are very good reads. I recommend them. So that's why it helps to have Egyptology books in your library along with the spirituality books, because you can cross-check and give yourself a fuller picture of, you know, what's going on. Lastly, and this is kind of related, he makes a claim about channeling deities. And this is on page 119 before he starts talking about his festival calendar, which we'll get to in a minute. He says, oftentimes members of the priesthood would represent different Hwt-Hru, allowing themselves to become vehicles for these divinities as the inherent power brought through the ceremony took over. All of this was done under the careful constraints of designated rituals that had been in use for thousands of years. Then why do we not have anything written down somewhere that talks about how to channel a deity? Because they didn't do that. There's a difference between invoking a deity in ritual and saying, I am Horus who has come to bring the eye to his father, you know, and then actually channeling it. The one exception is a very old part of the opening of the mouth ritual that was done on statues, where the Sem priest would actually go into a dreamlike state and then say, you know, I've seen my father, you know, but that's actually something very archaic. It's the general consensus of scholars that things like that, you know, have a kinship with shamanism, are vestiges of pre-literate, pre-dynastic religion, and as their society developed, and that's another thing. A lot of people like to say, oh, ancient Egyptian religion never changed over 3,000 years. Yes, it did. Okay, the cannibal hymn is my favorite example. You know, you have that in the pyramid text of Unas saying that he's going to eat the gods and devour their magic. And after a while they said, you know, maybe let's not put that in the tomb. So after a while you stop seeing that. And this whole thing about channeling deities is something that has been added, I think, in recent times and is not really reflective of the ancient religion. Now that said, we got all the bad influence out of the way. Here's some good things I have to say about Eye of the Sun. For one, the rituals themselves that he gives in here, I like. I can tell that he's used them before. And my only complaint is that they could have been given separate from the main text, so for a little bit of clarity, so it would be easier. You're just reading about different discussions and, oh, hey, there's a ritual in here. Let me write this. You know, other than organization, I like them. I can tell where they came from. You know, he's borrowing from he's drawing from the coffin, the pyramid texts, from the temple texts in Dendera, and, you know, places like that. And, you know, the wording is a little different, but I still recognize it. He also gives some recipes in here. There's a recipe for natron, there's a recipe for Kefi. What's interesting is there are a couple of ingredients from the ancient Kefi recipe that we haven't identified. Aspalathos is one of them. We don't know what kind of plant Aspalathos is. Here he uses laurel and bay leaf, I think, for presumably substitutions for the things that we can't identify. So if you used his recipe, you'd get a particularly unique blend of Kefi, or Kapet. So, actually, what's interesting is he has a recipe for Kefi, he has a recipe for natron, so does the House of Necher's beginner guide, their beginner course. As a matter of fact, what I would say is if you've been considering taking the beginner course for the House of Necher, what you might want to do is just get this book instead and read through it, and don't sit there and read a chapter a week like they tell you to. Just read the whole thing, and you'll get even more information than they give with less peer pressure. So, another thing I like about this book is, yes, it's a focused tradition. Hathor is the central goddess in this tradition. That's okay. If you grew up living around the Temple of Dendera or another temple dedicated to Hathor, that might have been your, you know, way of viewing the world. So there's a historical precedence for this, and so I don't mind that at all. It's, you know, kind of cool. As for his calendar, that was something that a lot of people were interested in and had asked about. Now, I got this book after I had written Celebrating the Egyptian Gods. I have a calendar in here. It's not as extensive as his. His is a lot longer, But a lot of the same festivals are listed. The only difference is the names are a little different in here, and he uses the month names from the Middle Kingdom, whereas I'm using the newer ones from the late New Kingdom and afterward. But otherwise, and mine is a little more streamlined. I didn't want to put every single thing in here, but he's got a pretty extensive one. The only thing is, his contention is that the festival calendar in ancient Egypt was lunar-based, which is plausible, I think, at least in part, because there are some holidays that were observed according to the phase of the moon. As for the entire calendar, I think it was a blend, a lunisolar. And he says in here, on the back matter, here the reader will also find easy-to-use instructions for accurately calculating the Egyptian calendar and sacred festivals. I disagree with the easy-to-use part. Trying to understand this as he was explaining it, for me it was a little dicey. I'm going, I'd have to spend some time on this one, because it would change from year to year. It would be based on when the moon, became, when you got the new moon close to the rising of Sirius, and that's going to vary a little bit from year to year, and don't make me think that hard, especially when I have so many other things to do. That's why I use a fixed solar calendar for mine. But another interesting thing about this, though, and this is something that I really want to point out, the main source that he is using, and that the House of Netra uses, a lot of people use, it's one of my sources, is it's actually something that you can find on the Oriental Institute's website and download it for free. The Calendars of Ancient Egypt by Richard A. Parker. It's published in 1950 from the Oriental Institute in Egyptian Civilization. The thing is, again, it was published in 1950. Since then, a lot more material has been contributed to the discipline, including how we render certain date names that are used in here. See, the thing is, the name for the full moon feast that Richard Parker gives is Tep Semdet. That name is used in Eye of the Sun and also in the House of Netra's calendars. However, in the source where I saw this first is in Mark Collier and Bill Manley's How to Read Egyptian Hieroglyphics. They cite that name as being a rather faulty translation, and instead they use Mejdionit, which means basically 15th day feast. They're interpolating off of the name 15th day because the full moon came in the middle of the month if you're starting from new moon and going to new moon. So that's one way that you can see a difference in the pedigree of research between what I the Sun and the House of Netra are doing with their work, and then what I do with mine. I've got some newer sources, and also another thing, Sem versus Setem priest. That kind of dates the sources that you're using too. Sem is the newer translation for that type of priest. So overall, while I completely disagree with the concept of Netra as ultimate divinity, and the ideas about the priests being these amazing mystical figures that could meditate all day long and could channel the deities, and they did this with all their rituals, I disagree with that. But if you want some practical information and maybe some ideas for some rituals that you can use, then put this one on your shelf too. I would rate this one up here with Circle of Isis. It has its issues, but again, if you want to get a broad spread, and especially if you want to skip a little bit of brouhaha with some online classes, go ahead and get this book. In other news, for one, I want to give a shout out. You might have heard this clinking, but Yamanu gave me this wonderful leopard head pendant, which I have added to my stole, and thank you so much for that. And I'm working on adding some neat things in my store. I wanted to kind of show this off for a second. It's still in construction, but this is going to be a box shrine of the type called a naos in Greek, a car shrine if you're reading the Eternal Egypt, you know, the Kemetic reconstructions thing. I'm still working on getting the doors on it, because I've got the hinges, but I've got some other parts that I'm waiting to have come in, including a sliding bolt. That's something that most cabinets do not have, and especially if you're trying to recite from Egyptian temple rituals, they would describe the bolt being slid back, and you know, there was a part of the ritual that was involved with that. So anyway, that's one of the projects I'm working on. Hopefully in another week or two you'll find it on my Etsy store. Be sure to check that out. I've got lots of other things in there, including some new book shrines. I also have more Druid beads and some Ishtar beads, and you know, hoping to expand more things from there. So for the Kemetic How-To Guide, thanks as always for watching. It's good to be back. And this is Sharon wishing you Senebti. Enjoyed this video? Then be sure to hit like and subscribe to the Kemetic Independent channel. You can also buy my books on lulu.com, shop handmade pagan supplies in my Etsy store, and get your official Kemetic Independent gear on Zazzle. Go ahead and hit pause for the links. You can even rewind and watch this video again.